The Kansas wind swept across the O'Connell farm, carrying the scent of damp earth and impending spring. It was a landscape of rolling gold and deep brown, a checkerboard of generational sweat and modern agricultural ambition. Standing at the edge of the farmyard, 26-year-old Alex O'Connell surveyed his kingdom. He was a man firmly planted in the 21st century, a recent agronomy graduate who believed that farming was less about the dirt under one's fingernails and more about the data flowing through a fiber-optic cable. Before him sat the crown jewel of his ambition, a brand-new, $500,000 John Deere 8R series tractor. It was an absolute marvel of modern engineering, painted in the iconic, blindingly vibrant green and yellow. It boasted dual tires taller than a grown man, a 12-liter diesel engine capable of churning out over 400 horsepower, and a cab that resembled the cockpit of a luxury jet more than a piece of farm equipment. It had satellite-guided auto steering, real-time soil analysis sensors, and a climate-controlled, air-cushioned seat. It was the machine that was going to drag the O'Connell farm out of the past and into an era of ruthless, optimized efficiency. Yet, as Alex admired the pristine green paint, his eyes caught the shadow of the old weathered barn at the edge of the property line. The barn's roof sagged like the spine of an exhausted workhorse, and the siding was stripped of its red paint by decades of prairie storms. Inside that barn sat the very thing Alex despised most about his family's legacy. It was a 1912 K-Steam traction engine. To Alex, the massive rusted iron beast was a festering visual pustule on his otherwise high-tech operation. It was a hulking, terrifyingly heavy relic of the Industrial Revolution, weighing nearly 20 tons of solid steel, cast iron, and brass. It had enormous lugged steel wheels, a towering smokestack, and a labyrinth of exposed gears, pipes, and valves. For decades, his grandfather, Arthur O'Connell, had treated the machine like a beloved family pet. Arthur had spent his twilight years covered in soot and thick black grease, meticulously maintaining the monstrous boiler, listening to the hiss of steam as if it were a symphony. Alex shook his head, turning his back on the open shed doors. The steam engine was nothing but junk. It was a monument to a bygone era of inefficiency, backbreaking labor, and dangerous mechanics. He had meant to call the scrapyard months ago, right after Grandpa Arthur's funeral, but a lingering, irrational shred of guilt had stayed his hand. He kept telling himself he would sell it for scrap metal as soon as the spring planting was finished. The massive chunks of iron would probably fetch a decent price, enough to pay for a few extra tons of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. The truth was, Alex needed every penny he could scrounge. The financial reality of the O'Connell farm was a crushing weight on his young shoulders. When Arthur passed away from a sudden heart attack the previous autumn, Alex had inherited the land free and clear. But the land alone wasn't enough to compete in the modern agricultural market. Believing he had to modernize immediately to survive, Alex had leveraged the farm's equity to the absolute breaking point. He had taken out massive, high-interest loans to purchase the John Deere 8R, a precision pneumatic planter, and a fleet of drones for aerial crop scouting. The bank's loan officer had warned him about the tight margins. If the upcoming harvest wasn't absolutely perfect, if the yields didn't increase by at least 20% through his high-tech methods, the bank would foreclose. The O'Connell family had worked this specific patch of Kansas dirt for 5 generations. Alex was terrified he was going to be the one to lose it. He walked back toward the farmhouse, the gravel crunching under his boots. His mind drifted back to the arguments he used to have with his grandfather on the front porch. Arthur, with his deeply tanned, calloused hands resting on his denim overalls, would shake his head at Alex's college textbooks. "You can't farm from a computer screen, Al," Arthur would say, his voice a slow, gravelly drawl. "The soil has a memory. It breathes. You have to feel it under your boots. You have to respect its moods. All those microchips and satellites, they're fine for telling you where you've been, but they don't know a damn thing about the heart of the land. That takes time. That takes iron and patience." Alex would roll his eyes. "Grandpa, it's about yield mapping and variable rate seeding. It's chemistry and physics. The old ways are just guessing. The new ways are guarantees." Arthur would just smile that quiet, knowing smile and wander back out to the barn to polish the brass pressure gauge on his beloved K-Steam engine. The roar of a heavy diesel engine snapped Alex out of his memories. A cloud of white dust was barreling down the county road, kicking up behind a gleaming, lifted Platinum Edition pickup truck. The truck swerved into the O'Connell driveway, its massive tires tearing up the gravel, and slammed on the brakes right next to Alex's new John Deere. The driver's door opened and Caleb Mercer stepped out. If Alex was trying to drag his farm into the modern era, Caleb Mercer was already living in it, and he wanted everyone to know. Caleb was the corporate farmer next door. He didn't just run a family farm. He ran an agricultural empire, constantly buying out smaller neighbors who couldn't keep up with the financial demands of modern farming. Caleb was in his mid-40s, slick, arrogant, and possessed a fleet of equipment that made Alex's new tractor look like a child's plaything. "Morning, O'Connell," Caleb drawled, leaning against the bed of his truck. He wore a designer polo shirt tucked into perfectly clean jeans, a stark contrast to Alex's work-worn Carhartt jacket. Caleb's eyes drifted over the John Deere. "See, the bank finally let you buy a real toy. Hope you know how to program the damn thing. I hear the interface on those new 8Rs is a nightmare if you don't have a software degree." "I can manage, Caleb," Alex said, crossing his arms, feeling his jaw tighten. "What do you want? I've got field prep to do." Caleb chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He looked past Alex, his gaze landing on the dilapidated barn and the massive shadow of the steam engine within. "Actually, I came by to do you a favor. I noticed you still haven't cleared out that iron tumor your granddaddy was so obsessed with." Alex stiffened. "The steam engine is none of your business. It's an eyesore, Alex, and frankly, it's a hazard. You've got a shiny new operation here. You don't need a rusty, glorified tea kettle dragging down your property value." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver money clip. He peeled off 5 $100 bills. "I've got a flatbed heading to the smelter in Topeka tomorrow. I'll give you $500 right now, cash, and I'll haul that piece of dangerous junk off your land. Save you the towing fee." It wasn't a genuine offer of help, and Alex knew it. It was an insult. Caleb had always mocked Grandpa Arthur. Caleb represented everything ruthless and sterile about modern farming, and he wanted to erase the last physical monument to Arthur's deeply held beliefs. Caleb wanted to humiliate the memory of the old man who had stubbornly refused to sell his land to the Mercer Empire. Alex looked at the crisp $100 bills. He desperately needed the money. $500 was a drop in the bucket of his debt, but it was fuel for the tractor. It was groceries. Yet, as he looked at Caleb's smug, condescending face, a sudden fierce spike of pride flared in his chest. He hated the steam engine, yes, but it was O'Connell junk. "Keep your money, Caleb," Alex said, his voice dropping an octave. "The case isn't for sale. Not to you, not to a scrapyard. Now get off my property before I test out the torque on my new tractor by dragging your shiny truck out to the highway." Caleb's smile vanished. His eyes hardened into cold, flat stones. He slowly put the money back in his pocket. "Suit yourself, college boy. But when the bank comes to lock the gates this winter because you couldn't make your yield, don't come crying to me for a buyout. I'll just buy it at auction for pennies on the dollar." Caleb climbed back into his truck, slammed the door, and sped off, showering Alex's boots in a fresh layer of gravel dust. Alex stood there, his heart pounding with irritation. He glared at the barn. Why had he defended that stupid machine? He stomped over to the open shed doors, intending to throw a tarp over the colossal iron beast, just so he wouldn't have to look at it anymore. As he stepped into the dim, dusty interior of the shed, the sheer scale of the case, 1912, loomed over him. The front wheels alone were chest-high, made of thick steel plates dotted with heavy rivets. The boiler was a massive cylinder of black iron, and the rear drive wheels were wider than oil drums, equipped with fierce steel cleats designed to grip raw earth. Alex climbed up the heavy iron step onto the engineer's platform at the rear. The air here smelled of stale soot, ancient oil, and the sharp tang of rusted iron. He reached out and swiped a layer of grime off the brass builder's plate riveted to the boiler. J.I. Case Threshing Machine Co., Racine, Wisconsin, 1912. Beside the heavy iron steering wheel and the massive levers that controlled the steam flow, Alex noticed something he hadn't seen before. Tucked beneath the coal bunker, secured to the floorboards, was a heavy, military-style metal lockbox. The padlock on it was completely seized with rust. Curiosity overriding his frustration, Alex grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench and brought it down hard on the padlock. With a sharp crack, the rusted shackle broke. He opened the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped meticulously in a heavy oiled canvas tarp to protect it from the elements, was a thick, leather-bound notebook. Alex carefully opened the cover. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with the elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting of his grandfather, Arthur. It was a restoration journal. Alex turned the pages, mesmerized despite himself. The journal wasn't just a log of repairs. It was a love letter to mechanical engineering. Arthur had documented every single valve replacement, every boiler tube cleaning, every adjustment to the slide valve. But interspersed among the technical diagrams of boiler pressures and water injectors were Arthur's personal philosophies. May 14th, 2004. One entry read, "Repacked the main steam gland today. It's hard work, heavy work. The younger generation thinks power comes from explosions inside a block of aluminum, loud and fast. They don't understand the power of expansion. Steam is water and fire, earth and air working together. When this old girl breathes, she doesn't scream. She sighs. She pulls with a torque that feels infinite, like the rotation of the earth itself. She has a soul of iron and steam. You don't drive her, you partner with her." Alex stared at the words. He felt a sharp, sudden pang of grief for the old man. Arthur had seen poetry in this rusty labyrinth of pipes. Alex gently closed the journal and placed it back in the box. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away, but he couldn't afford to live in the past. "Soul doesn't pay the loan officer, Grandpa," Alex whispered into the dusty silence of the barn. He climbed down from the platform, leaving the steam engine in the shadows, and walked back out into the bright, unforgiving light of the modern day. The pressure mounted as the week progressed. Unseasonably heavy spring rains had delayed planting by a critical 10 days. Every day the seeds weren't in the ground was a day of potential yield lost to the encroaching autumn frosts later in the year. Alex was working 20-hour shifts, using the tractor's GPS auto-steer to work through the night, illuminated by stadium-bright LED work lights. Finally, only one field remained to be prepped before the planters could roll. It was an 80-acre tract in the lowest part of the farm, bordered by a dense line of cottonwood trees. The locals called it Devil's Swamp. It was a topographical nightmare, a natural basin that collected runoff from the surrounding miles. The soil there was incredibly rich, black alluvial dirt that could grow corn tall enough to hide a house, but it was notoriously treacherous. The water table sat just inches beneath the surface well into the late spring. Grandpa Arthur had a strict, unbreakable rule about Devil's Swamp. He never, under any circumstances, put heavy equipment into that basin until the wild goldenrod weeds along the fence line bloomed. It was a natural, biological indicator that the deep subsurface water had finally receded enough to support weight. Alex parked his truck at the edge of the basin as the sun began to climb. He looked at the fence line. The goldenrod was green, but there were no yellow blooms. Not a single one. He pulled out his iPad and opened the farm management app. He tapped into the remote soil moisture sensors he had installed last month. The digital readout showed that the top 3 inches of soil were perfectly dry, within the optimal parameters for the heavy ripper implement to tear up the earth. Alex looked from the screen to the field and then back to the screen. The conflict between generational wisdom and modern data gnawed at him. He remembered Arthur's warnings about the bottomless slurry beneath the crust. But then he remembered the bank. He remembered the loan payments. He couldn't afford to wait 2 more weeks for a weed to bloom. He had to plant now. "I'm not driving a 1950s 2-wheel drive tin can," Alex muttered to himself, justifying the decision. "I have a 12-ton tractor with massive footprint dual tires and satellite terrain mapping. It distributes weight perfectly. The data says go. I'm going." He walked back to the John Deere 8R, climbed up the pristine steps, and settled into the leather seat. He fired up the massive diesel engine, the sound a confident, muffled roar inside the soundproofed cab. He queued up a rock playlist on the Bluetooth stereo, cranked the air conditioning, and engaged the transmission. The colossal green machine rolled forward, descending the slight grade into Devil's Swamp. Attached to the rear drawbar was a massive 30-foot-wide steel ripper, an implement with heavy steel shanks designed to tear deep into the soil and break up compaction. For the first 100 yards, it was a dream. The GPS monitor painted perfect straight green lines on the screen. The auto-steer kept the tractor perfectly aligned. The heavy steel shanks of the ripper sliced through the dry topsoil like a hot knife through butter, churning up beautiful dark earth behind him. Alex smiled, feeling a surge of vindication. The technology was working perfectly. Grandpa Arthur's old wives' tales were just that, tales. Then, exactly halfway across the massive basin, the tone of the diesel engine changed. It went from a smooth, powerful purr to a deep, guttural lugging sound. The tractor shuddered violently. Alex glanced at the digital dashboard. A yellow warning light was flashing angrily. Wheel slip 20%. "Come on, push through it," Alex said, reaching over to the electronic throttle and bumping up the RPMs. He manually engaged the differential locks, forcing all 4 sets of massive dual tires to turn at the exact same speed, maximizing traction. The warning light flashed red. Wheel slip 40%. Wheel slip 60%. The tractor wasn't moving forward anymore. The pristine, dry crust of topsoil that the sensors had promised had shattered under the immense 12-ton weight of the machine. Beneath that 3-inch crust was a subterranean nightmare of saturated clay and trapped spring runoff. It was exactly as Arthur had described it, a bottomless slurry. The spinning dual tires, each standing over 6 feet tall and nearly a yard wide, instantly lost all friction. The heavy rubber lugs, designed to grip firm soil, simply acted like giant mixing paddles, turning the earth into a slick, black soup. Alex slammed his hand onto the main hydraulic lever, frantically trying to lift the heavy steel ripper out of the ground to reduce the drag. But it was too late. The sinking happened with terrifying, inexorable speed. The tractor didn't just get stuck, it was swallowed. The massive tires dug deep trenches, displacing the liquid mud until there was nowhere left to go. With a sickening, wet suction sound, the belly pan of the $400,000 John Deere slammed flat against the surface of the mud. The axles were buried. The tires were submerged past their hubs in a vacuum-tight seal of heavy, wet clay. Alex killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening, broken only by the frantic beat of his own heart. He sat paralyzed, staring at the GPS monitor, which was still brightly displaying his perfect, green, completely useless digital lines. Panic set in. He restarted the engine, threw it into reverse, and feathered the throttle. The tires spun uselessly, spraying fountains of black mud into the air, but the chassis didn't move a fraction of an inch. He tried turning the wheels hard left, then hard right, trying to let the lugs catch the edge of the ruts. Nothing. The tractor was high-centered on the earth itself, utterly paralyzed. He shut off the engine again, his hands trembling. He opened the cab door. The smell of raw, wet earth hit him like a physical blow. He climbed down the steps and dropped to the ground. He instantly sank to his knees in freezing, slick mud. Alex waded around the machine, his heart sinking further with every step. It was a disaster of epic proportions. The tractor was dead weight, anchored into the swamp by thousands of pounds of suction. It was miles away from any solid road. A standard tow truck couldn't even get close to this field without suffering the same fate. Despair, cold and heavy, washed over him. He was ruined. If he couldn't get the tractor out, he couldn't plant. If he couldn't plant, he couldn't harvest. The bank would take everything. As he stood waist-deep in the muck, leaning his head against the muddy yellow rim of the tractor tire, he heard a sound drifting across the basin. It was the roar of a monstrous engine. Alex looked up toward the ridgeline. Sitting perfectly on the edge of the firm, Gravel County Road was Caleb Mercer's flagship machine, a monstrous Case IH Quadtrac, an articulated beast that ran on 4 massive rubber tracks instead of wheels, designed specifically for flotation on soft ground. Caleb stepped out of the cab, standing on the high platform. Even from a distance, Alex could see the bright, gleaming white of Caleb's teeth as he grinned. Caleb cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled down into the basin, his voice carrying over the wind. "Hey, college boy, looks like your fancy iPad didn't know about the swamp." Caleb laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the empty fields. "I told you that new paint job wouldn't help you farm." Alex clenched his fists, feeling the cold mud seep into his boots. "Go to hell, Caleb," he yelled back, though his voice cracked with desperation. Caleb leaned over the railing of his tractor. "Tell you what, O'Connell, I'm feeling neighborly. I've got heavy logging cables in the back. My tracks can stay on the firm dirt here, and I'll winch your expensive paperweight out of the mud." Alex felt a flicker of hope, immediately crushed by suspicion. "How much?" Caleb's grin widened into a predatory sneer. $5,000, cash, by tomorrow morning." He paused, letting the exorbitant number hang in the air. "And you sign over the title to that piece of junk steam engine in your barn right now. I want to watch the scrapyard torch it to pieces. It's a package deal, Alex. You want your farm saved? You let me take out your granddaddy's trash." The sheer malice of the offer hung in the twilight air. Caleb didn't just want money, he wanted complete submission. He wanted to buy the destruction of Arthur O'Connell's legacy as the price of admission to save Alex's modern dream. Alex looked at his buried $500,000 tractor. He thought about the bank. He thought about the loans. Then he thought about the faded handwriting in the canvas-wrapped journal. "She has a soul of iron and steam." Pride, hot and fierce, burned through his despair. He would rather lose the farm to the bank than surrender his grandfather's memory to Caleb Mercer's ego. "I'd rather let it sink to the center of the earth," Alex roared back, his voice tearing at his throat. Caleb shrugged dramatically, clearly enjoying the show. "Suit yourself. Hope you know how to swim in debt, boy." Caleb climbed back into his massive tracked machine, hit the air horn in a mocking double blast, and drove away, the roar of his engine fading into the distance. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. The sun dipped below the Kansas horizon, bleeding orange and purple across the sky, casting long, dark shadows over the prairie. The temperature began to drop rapidly. Alex stood alone, knee-deep in the freezing mud of Devil's Swamp, a prisoner of his own arrogance and technology. He slowly turned his head, looking back up the long incline toward the farmstead. There, silhouetted starkly against the fading twilight sky, stood the old, sagging barn, and inside it, resting in the cold, dusty shadows, sat the massive, silent shape of the 1912 Case steam engine, waiting. The farmhouse kitchen was suffocatingly quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic ticking of the wall clock. It was 2 a.m. Alex O'Connell sat at the scarred oak table, still wearing his mud-caked boots. The dried clay from Devil's Swamp flaked off onto the linoleum, a physical reminder of his absolute failure. Outside, under the pale glow of the moon, his $500,000 John Deere remained swallowed by the earth, a monument to his arrogance. He had spent the last 4 hours agonizing over spreadsheets on his laptop. The math was brutally simple and entirely unforgiving. Renting a heavy-duty extraction rig from the county seat would cost thousands he didn't have. Waiting for the swamp to dry could take a month, by which point the planting season would be completely lost. The bank's foreclosure notice might as well have been already sitting in his mailbox. Alex pushed the laptop away, the glowing screen making his eyes ache. His gaze drifted to the heavy, oil-stained canvas bundle sitting on the opposite end of the table. He had brought Grandpa Arthur's journal inside. With trembling, exhausted hands, he untied the leather cord and opened the brittle pages. He wasn't looking for a mechanical schematic. He was looking for a voice. He desperately needed his grandfather's steady, gravelly voice. He flipped through the logs of boiler pressures and valve clearances until he found a longer entry, dated April of 1978. Spring came in like a drowned rat this year, Arthur's sweeping cursive read. County boys got their big road grader high-centered down by the creek crossing, hub-deep in blue clay. They brought out 2 modern diesel tractors to yank it free, just ended up spinning rubber and digging themselves their own graves. They called me laughing, asking if I wanted to bring the tea kettle down to pull them all out. I fired the case. Took me 3 hours to build a proper head of steam. But when we hooked the chains, the case didn't slip. She didn't spin. Rubber relies on friction. Iron relies on gravity and grip. A diesel engine screams when it meets resistance. A steam engine just leans into the harness. True strength isn't about shouting loud or moving fast. It's about holding fast, applying the torque, and never letting go. And steam never lets go. Alex read the paragraph 3 times. A diesel engine screams when it meets resistance. A steam engine just leans into the harness. He closed his eyes, picturing the massive steel cleats on the rear wheels of the 1912 Case. They were designed for this. They were designed to bite into soft, raw earth before paved roads even existed. It was a completely insane idea. It was a desperate, unhinged Hail Mary. If it failed, Caleb Mercer would laugh him out of the county, and he would lose the farm anyway. But if it worked, Alex grabbed his cell phone. He opened a browser and searched for the Kansas Prairie Steam and Gas Historical Society, a group his grandfather had belonged to. It was 2:30 a.m., but he found a contact number for the chapter president, an octogenarian named Elias Jenkins. Alex left a rambling, desperate voicemail, begging for help, explaining the situation, and mentioning Arthur O'Connell's name. He didn't sleep. He sat at the table, watching the sun slowly crest the horizon, painting the kitchen in pale gold. At 6:15 a.m., his phone buzzed. "This is Elias," a voice like grinding rocks rasped through the speaker. "You're Arthur's boy, the one with the computers." "Yes, sir, I am." Alex swallowed hard. "Mr. Jenkins, my tractor is buried to the axles in Devil's Swamp. Caleb Mercer wants my grandfather's case for scrap in exchange for a tow. I want to fire the case up. I want to pull it out myself, but I don't know how." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Alex thought the old man had hung up. Then Elias chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. "Arthur always said you'd figure out the dirt eventually, kid. Don't touch a damn valve on that boiler. I'm calling the boys. We'll be there in an hour." By 8 o'clock, the O'Connell farmyard looked like a retirement home for heavy mechanics. 3 beat-up pickup trucks rattled up the driveway, depositing a half-dozen men in faded denim overalls and grease-stained caps. They moved with a slow, deliberate stiffness, but their eyes were sharp, evaluating the farm, the distant stuck tractor, and finally, the sagging barn. Elias Jenkins, a man who looked like he was carved out of old saddle leather, walked up to Alex. He didn't offer a handshake. He just nodded toward the barn. Let's see if the old girl still has a heartbeat. They threw open the wide barn doors, letting the morning sunlight spill over the massive black iron of the Case 1912. The old men didn't see junk. They approached the machine with a reverence that bordered on the religious. They ran calloused hands over the cold boiler steel, checked the Babbitt bearings on the massive flywheel, and inspected the heavy, riveted water tanks. Arthur drained her dry and oiled the flues before he passed, Elias announced, his head inside the firebox. Smart old bird. Saved the boiler from rusting out. She's dirty, she's stiff, but she ain't dead. What followed was a masterclass in 19th century engineering. Alex, whose entire agricultural education revolved around touchscreens and satellite telemetry, found himself utterly out of his depth. He became an apprentice to the Graybeards. He fetched heavy canvas buckets of water from the main line, pouring hundreds of gallons into the boiler. He climbed into the coal bunker, shoveling heavy black bituminous coal, Arthur's emergency stash, into the tender. Elias handed Alex an oversized grease gun and pointed to the massive open gears of the drivetrain. Pack them full, kid. Every single tooth. That's a direct drive. When the pressure hits the piston, it transfers straight to the wheels. No computer chips to slip, no torque converters to bleed power. Just raw, unadulterated physics. For hours they worked. They polished the brass sight glasses, freed up the sticky throttle lever, and checked the intricate governor belt. Alex's hands were stained black with grease and soot. His back ached, his knuckles were scraped, but a strange, profound sense of connection began to wash over him. He was touching the exact levers his grandfather had pulled. He was learning the mechanical anatomy of a beast that had helped tame the very dirt he was now failing to manage. Around noon, the distinctive roar of a modern diesel engine echoed down the road. Caleb Mercer's gleaming platinum pickup pulled up to the fence line. Caleb leaned out the window, staring at the chaotic scene around the barn. "Well, well, well," Caleb shouted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Having a museum exhibit, O'Connell? Or did you just invite the local retirement home over to look at your scrap metal?" The old men paused their work, glaring at Caleb. Elias wiped his hands on a rag, spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt, and stared Caleb down. "We're waking up a giant, Mercer," Elias rasped loudly. "Best you run along in your little toy truck before she clears her throat." Caleb laughed, though it sounded slightly forced. "You're all crazy. That rusty bomb is going to explode and take the barn with it. My offer stands, Alex. $5,000 and the scrap title. Clock's ticking." He rolled up his window and sped off, kicking up a shower of gravel. "Ignore the buzzard," Elias muttered, turning back to the firebox. "Grab some kindling, kid. It's time to light the fire." Alex gathered dry wood, feeding it into the deep iron belly of the firebox. Elias struck a long match and tossed it in. The dry wood caught instantly. Soon, black coal was shoveled on top of the roaring flames. The resurrection of the Case was not instantaneous. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful build. Unlike a diesel engine that roared to life with the turn of a key, the steam engine had to be coaxed. It took over 2 hours for the water to begin boiling. Alex stood on the heavy iron platform, feeling the ambient temperature rise. The machine began to speak. First, it was a subtle, metallic groaning, the heavy iron boiler plates expanding as the heat soaked into the metal. Then, a low, bubbling hiss echoed from the pipes. "Watch the needle, Alex," Elias instructed, pointing to the polished brass pressure gauge. The needle trembled off the zero peg. It slowly, steadily climbed. 10 pounds, 20 pounds, 50 pounds per square inch. The smell of burning coal, hot grease, and wet steam filled the air, a pungent, intoxicating perfume of raw industry. At 100 pounds of pressure, Elias reached up and pulled a braided cord. A deafening, triumphant steam whistle shrieked across the Kansas prairie. It was a sound from another century, a booming, echoing cry that sent a flock of crows scattering from the cottonwood trees miles away. It wasn't just a noise, it was a physical vibration that rattled Alex's teeth. "She's awake," Elias grinned, his eyes twinkling under his soot-stained cap. "Let's go fishing for a John Deere." Word had traveled fast in the rural county. As the heavy Case engine chuffed out of the barn, its massive steel wheels grinding against the gravel, a small crowd of neighboring farmers had gathered along the county road. Pickups were parked along the shoulder. People sat on their tailgates, watching in hushed anticipation. Among them, parked conspicuously at the best vantage point, was Caleb Mercer's truck. Caleb stood leaning against the hood, arms crossed, a smirk plastered on his face, clearly waiting for the spectacle of Alex's final humiliation. Alex stood on the engineer's platform, dressed in a heavy denim jacket, soot already smudging his cheek. He had found Arthur's old striped engineer's cap hanging on a nail and pulled it firmly onto his head. He looked exactly like the man Caleb Mercer had mocked for years. Elias stood beside him, guiding Alex's hands. "Slow and steady, kid. She steers like a battleship." Alex pulled the heavy iron steering wheel. The massive chain-driven front axle slowly pivoted. He gently eased the throttle lever back. Steam rushed into the massive single cylinder. The huge, exposed piston rod thrust forward, turning the heavy flywheel. The gears engaged with a deep, resonant clank. Chuff, chuff, chuff. The case moved forward. It was slow, barely a walking pace, but the sheer, unstoppable momentum of 20 tons of rolling iron was terrifying and magnificent. They trundled down the dirt path toward the edge of Devil's Swamp. As they approached the basin, the modern John Deere looked pathetic. It was canted at an awkward angle, its brilliant green paint splattered with black mud, buried so deep that its chassis was resting entirely on the earth. Alex maneuvered the massive case to the very edge of the firm ground, right where the goldenrod grew, stopping just feet from the slick, treacherous mud. He pulled the brake and shut off the steam to the drive gears. The engine sat idling, a dragon breathing heavy white steam into the afternoon air. Elias and 2 other old men waded into the muck, dragging heavy, inch-thick forged steel logging chains. They disappeared under the belly of the stuck John Deere, wrapping the chains around the thickest part of the front axle assembly, creating a secure bridle. They dragged the other end up the slope and dropped the massive iron ring over the heavy drawbar pin at the rear of the case. Elias waded back, covered in mud, and climbed up onto the platform. He looked at the chains, then looked at Alex. "All right, Al, the slack is out. The chain is tight. That green toy out there weighs 12 tons, plus the suction of the mud holding it down. You're going to need all of it. Don't jerk it. Just open the throttle wide and let the governor figure out the load. Let the iron do the talking." Alex gripped the polished iron handle of the throttle. He looked out at the crowd on the road. He saw Caleb Mercer sneering, shaking his head. He looked down at the sunk John Deere, his symbol of modern failure. And then he felt the heavy, vibrating warmth of the boiler radiating through his boots. He felt the soul of the machine his grandfather had loved. "Here we go, Grandpa," Alex whispered. He pulled the throttle lever all the way back. The governor valve snapped open, dumping massive volumes of high-pressure steam into the cylinder. The exhaust, venting straight up through the smokestack, changed from a gentle chuff to a violent, deafening bark. Bang! 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 Thick columns of black coal smoke and white steam shot 30 feet into the sky. The massive rear wheels of the case began to turn. The heavy logging chain immediately pulled taut as a bowstring, lifting out of the mud, groaning under an unimaginable strain. The case hit the resistance of the buried tractor. For one terrifying second, the steam engine stopped moving. The massive flywheel continued to spin, but the drive wheels held still. The exhaust barked faster, louder, screaming against the load. Alex's heart stopped. If the wheels spun here, on the edge of the swamp, the case would dig its own grave, and the disaster would be absolute. But the wheels didn't spin. The wide, heavy steel cleats, driven by a torque that didn't rely on high RPMs but on sheer, relentless expansion of steam, bit deeply into the hard-packed earth of the bank. The iron dug in. Bang! 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 The front wheels of the case actually lifted a fraction of an inch off the ground under the extreme pulling force. The machine squatted down, leaning into the harness just as Arthur had written. Down in the swamp, the earth groaned. A sickening, loud schluck echoed across the basin as the vacuum seal of the deep mud was finally broken. The John Deere shuddered violently. "She's moving! Keep the valve open!" Elias roared over the deafening exhaust, slapping Alex on the shoulder. Centimeter by agonizing centimeter, the green tractor was dragged forward. The mud parted around its chassis like thick, black water. The steam engine didn't falter. It didn't slip. It just pulled with the relentless, unyielding inevitability of a glacier. The crowd on the road was completely silent, captivated by the raw display of mechanical dominance. With a final, massive heave, the John Deere's front tires breached the edge of the mud, finding the solid incline. The case kept marching, its exhaust settling back into a steady, rhythmic rhythm, dragging the dead weight of the modern tractor entirely out of Devil's Swamp and up onto the dry, firm grass of the headland. Alex pushed the throttle closed. The exhaust quieted to a gentle hiss. The silence that rushed back over the farm was profound. He engaged the heavy mechanical brake and leaned over the side of the platform. The John Deere sat safely on solid ground, safe, salvageable, and free. Suddenly a cheer erupted from the county road. The neighboring farmers were clapping, whistling, and hollering. Alex looked up. Through the dissipating cloud of white steam, he saw Caleb Mercer. Caleb wasn't smiling. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. He looked at the massive, soot-stained case, then at the cheering crowd, realizing his public attempt to humiliate the O'Connell legacy had spectacularly backfired. Without a word, Caleb turned, got into his gleaming truck, and drove away, entirely forgotten. Alex sagged back against the coal bunker, his legs trembling from the adrenaline. He was covered in black soot, sweat, and grease. He had never felt more exhausted, and he had never felt more alive. Elias Jenkins pulled a dirty rag from his pocket and wiped his brow. He looked down at the modern tractor, then patted the hot iron of the boiler beside him. "Well, Al," the old man smiled, his eyes crinkling. "Looks like the scrapyard is going to have to wait another century or two." Alex reached out and rested his bare, calloused hand against the warm, vibrating brass of the builder's plate. He finally understood. The data, the satellites, the efficiency, they all had their place. They were the brain of the modern farm. But sitting here, breathing fire and water, was the heart. The following week, the fields finally dried. The John Deere, thoroughly pressure-washed and inspected, performed flawlessly, guided by satellites to plant the seeds with mathematical perfection. Alex managed the data, monitored the yields, and eventually satisfied the bank. He embraced the future, but things on the O'Connell farm had permanently changed. The 1912 Case steam engine did not go back into the dark shadows of the sagging barn. Instead, Alex poured a massive, reinforced concrete pad right at the front entrance of the farmstead, bordering the main county road. He spent his evenings that summer not just on spreadsheets, but with wire brushes and high-temperature paint. He restored the machine meticulously, preserving its working condition while highlighting its brutalist beauty. When it was finished, the engine stood there like a sentinel of iron and history. Bolted to the concrete in front of the massive front wheels was a heavy bronze plaque. It didn't mention the John Deere, and it didn't mention Devil's Swamp. It simply read, "Arthur O'Connell's Case, 1912. True strength holds fast." And a few times a year, right before the harvest began, when the autumn air turned crisp, Alex would carry a load of coal to the front of the farm. He would strike a match, wait for the pressure to build, and pull the heavy braided cord, letting the deafening, triumphant whistle echo across the fields, reminding the modern world that the deep roots of the earth still answered to iron and steam.